All right. Welcome back to the Art of Law, episode 21. I guess this is, or 20, part two, Everything Woofy, the sequel. Nice to see you again, Mark.
Hi, Sean. How's things?
All right. You just came back from a little vacation?
Yeah, I was in Croatia for a week, and it's actually sunny here in London today, so it's a bit of a surprise. And they have a bank holiday on Monday, but nobody knows why they have this holiday. But I mean, with lockdown, it doesn't really make a difference if it's a holiday or not. Saturday, Sunday, holiday, no holiday, it's all the same.
Every day a holiday. Love it. All right. So just do some housekeeping. This is, of course, a continuation of the Art of Law series. Everyone who registered or is presently at this recording will get a copy of this presentation, so no need to worry or take notes. Link to the YouTube channel is on this page as well. The last episode, Mark, had a lot of, we initially just wanted to do one episode on Woofy, but we got swamped with questions and there was a lot of stuff that we didn't cover. So this is part two for that. It'll get a little bit into some of the more nuances. And but of course, there's only so much we could talk about Woofy. So if you have any questions, just put it in the chat and I'll be able to see it and ask Mark some questions. So starting where we left off, Mark, this is the Woofy process. We'll go into I guess each step 1, 2, 3, and 4 and the post-registration matters for today's episode. But maybe just very briefly, like we like to do on this channel, maybe you can explain how this process has changed over time from when you started practicing in China versus today.
Okay, sure. I just lost the screen, sorry. I just have to get it back. Okay, it's better. Yeah, so I think, look, with the Woofies in the old days, we're talking back in the 90s, it was a very long process, and there seemed to be a lot of documents, and it seemed like nobody knew what they had to do. I think, though, this looks pretty similar, over time. I think, you had to always do a name pre-registration. I guess there the issue is it's only a Chinese official name that counts. And the other thing is where people have problems with the name pre-registrations, you have to give, I think it's 3 Chinese names and, in order of preference, and you may not wind up with your preferred one. And you may also not wind up with your trademark. So you may have a Chinese name trademarked, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll get to use the name as your company name. So that's a little bit of a hassle, but people get excited about it, but there's not much you can do, I think. And then the lease, that's another thing which people, it's always been like that. I guess a lot of people think it can be like Hong Kong or other jurisdictions where you can just buy an off-the-shelf company and have the official address at your lawyer's or corporate services firm. But in China, you won't know who's going to lease, who's going to approve it or register it if you don't know where it is. And so the lease thing takes forever. And so I guess, the main thing is, if you're looking at Shanghai or Beijing, you should pick a large district, which is, relatively developed, because I think it's easier than it used to be, but moving districts is still a bit of a hassle.
All right, so Mark, we'll get into, sorry to cut you off. We'll get into each of these steps along the way.
Right.
So maybe I'll just start off first with the number 1 here, the name pre-registration with the SAMR, formerly known as the SAIC. But like you said, Mark, that you do have, choosing your name is obviously important. And China is not unique in a way that, most countries require some type of name check to make sure that the company name that you're going after is available and not being used by somebody else. But what is unique, I guess, is what you wrote here in the book, which is what I was trying to get to, is that the name registration process has not really changed much over the years. And consists basically of the four sections which you put in the book. So maybe Mark, you can just go over choosing the name.
Okay, so I think, yeah, normally the investor name, even though it's on point 2, that normally goes first. So, you know, it would be something like Disney, and then you would have something like the industry description. So it could be something like Disney Entertainment. And then typically they would have a bracket, Shanghai close bracket, and then the type of form. So most of the, I mean, almost all the ones we've ever seen are Co Ltd. Some people want to have China, and then you have to have a big enough investment. From memory, it's like 50 billion renminbi or something. So, you know, that's also possible. Sometimes people put Shanghai at the front, but that's normally because they don't know what they're doing, because very hard to ever find the company if it's got Shanghai or the first name is the geographic descriptor. So I think here, can I use my English name? I mean, no, the only name is the Chinese name, is the official name. So maybe in your articles of association, you'll have the English name, but your English name will not appear on the business license. It will not be the official name. And then I think I just discussed the city name versus China name. And then I think the name pre-registration process, it's just you submit 3 names, they pick which one they like. It doesn't matter if it's your trademark or not. And so there may be a discrepancy between having your trademark name or your branded name and your, you know, company name. But for most people, it's not the end of the world. It's not the best situation, but typically the Chinese official name is just for contracts and invoicing. So I guess that's something which a lot of people stumble over, is the Chinese name.
Yeah, and this slide right here kind of gets to the, I guess, unique part about choosing a Chinese name is it's not you know, Roman alphabet, so it's character based. So from the name pre-registration process, Mark, when you say you have to choose 3 names, you know, is it why is that, first of all? Because is it something like your name might be too similar to another company's name, or is it like it might sound like another company's name, or is it like the characters are similar to another company's name, or is it all of the above?
I think, I mean, well, basically, I mean, they asked for 3 because just easier for their selection process, and you can normally vet whether you think it will work, but of course the authorities will look at it. I think they mostly look just at the characters' names if they're too similar, not the sound, because I mean, God, that would be a nightmare in Chinese, because, you know, so many things sound the same, and then nothing would get done. And you know, it's so we got that problem at the moment. We gave 3 names, and the client came back with 3 other names. And actually, I better not say it, but anyway, he came up with some names that were fine in Chinese but sounded rude in English. But anyway, that's I guess that's up for them to know. Well, here I think, you know, normally the Chinese company names, they would have like 2 or 3 characters, you know, much like a person's name. But like Sony Ericsson, they have like 5 characters, which is very long, you know. So that's kind of a bit strange. And then, you know, some of the famous names, these were already registered by somebody else, and like Viagra, Wei Ge, which sounds like strong brother, which is a great name. But the official name, I think, is One Eye Ke, which doesn't sound that great actually for Viagra, at least again, the English pronunciation. And so I think in the Sony Ericsson case and the Viagra case, the people who first, you know, copied the name, which wasn't registered yet, they ended up not being just, you know, trademark squatters. They ended up actually producing a competing product. So I guess we've talked about it in the past. It's important to, you know, secure your name, but this is mostly a trademark issue. And, you know, if you can make it consistent with the trademark strategy, New Balance is a good example because they have different names in different things. So I think their rep office had the meaning translation, then they had a woofie, and then they had like a brand, and all the names are different. So if it's possible, it's important to have the same name. But I would say if you can only have a really good name in trademarks, that's probably the more important one, because I think the company name is really just for invoicing and for contracts.
Yeah. And I think the kind of theme that we're going for today in today's presentation, even though the process, the registration process itself is, pretty straightforward. Once you start getting into some of the tangential issues associated with each step, it does get a little bit more nuanced. So the name pre-registration, obviously, just pick a couple names for your company sounds pretty straightforward, but there is that issue of protecting your name, trademarking your name, making sure that you're getting the website domain for that name. These are I guess some of the issues that might get overlooked when we're just going through the mechanical process of registering the entity. So Mark, here we have some, I guess, precautionary strategies for protecting your name.
Yeah, so I think getting it registered, I mean, some which we didn't say here, which probably didn't think about in the old days, but we've got quite a few clients coming lately from like the beauty industry, like cosmetic companies, and some of them are relatively successful in their home market, but because of the animal testing and everything, they really haven't done anything in China. And the Chinese trademark squatters, they're very, they must be really onto these things, because so many of those brands are relatively unknown in their home market, but somebody's already clearly registered their trademark in China just as a means. And so I think what I've told some people is, you can try and buy it, and we have strategies about how we try to buy it. I think litigation is really, unless you're really big, and if you're that big and you're that stupid that you haven't done it, then, well, you do probably deserve to pay something. So I think litigation, it's difficult. Buying back can be expensive, but it can also be time consuming. And so, we've actually told some clients, look, rebrand the product for China at the moment. And if you buy it back, then you can rebrand it back to the original brand. But if you just wait, because, I think a lot of people think I'm not that positive about lawyers. I'm not also that positive about trademark people, because the trademark people will always say, oh, it's no problem, or it's an 80% chance you'll get it. And then you wait, and then you find out, no, I didn't get it. Or we can litigate, we can oppose. And some people wait 2 or 3 years, and they're just always waiting. So I think sometimes it's better, especially if you're like an e-commerce type company where you're selling stuff, because if you don't have a Chinese name registered, you just can't even start doing the first step. You can't open a Tmall shop. You can't get someone to manufacture your product in China, because they will all want to see that you own the trademark. And you can't tell them, oh, it's my trademark, but Sean, who owns it in China? That doesn't work. So I think one thing I would add here is, be pragmatic. Maybe start with another name and see how the other thing works out, because I've seen too many people spin their wheels for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and I guess that the whole e-commerce part about your name and protecting your name, and also I guess choosing the right name for your entity, this is somewhat relatively new compared to when you wrote the book so many years ago. So these are all very good things to keep in mind. For the second step, Mark, here we have the lease matters, and you started to get into it, and I think we covered a little bit about it in the episode 20, the previous episode, a little bit about negotiating the lease. So if that's something you're interested in, we're not going to cover it today because we covered it last time, but you can just hit the YouTube channel and you can find it there. But I guess we'll get into some of the, the similar, like to the name pre-registration, some of the tangential issues, the issues around the edge of picking your lease. And one of the questions that a viewer sent in for this episode, Mark, was about physical office versus virtual office. I know that I think this is something that is, pretty commonly asked by some companies who maybe don't require, manufacturing, they're just looking for some office space. Maybe we could just put it to rest, Mark. Can you give us a little bit of background on the physical office versus virtual office tension here?
Yeah, so I think, mostly if you're going to set up a WFOE or rep office, in most places you need to have an office, and they normally need a separate address and a separate entrance. So you can't have 10 companies in one location like Unit 5B, on Wahailu or something. So that's the first step. And the physical office will also be where you will make the application. The virtual office, probably there's many exceptions, but the one which we come across most is in Waigaoqiao, the free trade zone in Shanghai. They do allow for the virtual office, and they've been doing that for a long time. But I remember we had these Dutch clients once, and they were such cheap, it sounds like the stereotype. I know Jerome's on there, but they were so cheap, and we found this thing about the physical office, and then, they said, oh, we really just want a virtual office. We just want a virtual office. And, so we got the Waigaoqiao guys, this is about 10, 12 years ago, and they agreed to give them like a postbox office, which was, I think, relatively revolutionary. And then the Dutch wrote back and they asked how many people could be sitting in the virtual office. And I wrote back to them, well, you can have as many as you want, but you can only do JPEG files. So you send us photos, like a non-fungible token, I guess now, and you can put those photos in the virtual office. So, it's the thing about clients. Sometimes it's so difficult to deal with them. Like, oh, we don't need an office, you don't want an office. And can you get a virtual office? And then after weeks of discussion with the Waigaoqiao, they said, okay, we'll give them a virtual office. Probably the Waigaoqiao guys were going to pay for the office themselves. And then the Dutch guys say, how many people can physically sit in the virtual office? So, that's the issue.
So it is, I guess, I guess from that story, is it, I guess, not only city by city basis, it's also district by district basis. I know you said Waigaoqiao allows this, but what about for anybody who's familiar with Shanghai watching, maybe like Jing'an or Shuhui, or is this, it does?
I don't think they allow it because I think they don't allow it because we've had some applications, and we really do need that lease or at least the letter of intent to show where we're going to set up. Like we're doing one at the moment in Channing in Shanghai, and they require it. And over the year, one of the big discussions was if you want to go into a WeWork or something, whether that space is big enough. And different districts have different opinions. Hongkou was always pretty, or Huangpu, they were pretty relaxed about it. Jing'an, there's always a bit of competition, and it was also for retail. So retail, to get the whole license, you had to also have like some shop in that district as well. And Huangpu didn't do that. They would allow much more flexibility. So a lot of companies like G-Star or other companies, they set up there, and then somebody thinks, oh, we can do that as well. So it's a bit dynamic. I think you should check it. I think for woofies, they don't really care where you set up, but for rep offices, there's a list of buildings that are appropriate. So that's some of the things you have to check. So I think before you would enter the lease, get someone to double check that lease is fit for purpose.
Yeah, and that goes right into this next point here, making sure that that you're picking the appropriate site for the type of business that you're doing. I guess this is you mentioned earlier, Mark, about cosmetics companies, and they've, I guess, seen a lot of change in their industry and their relationship in China as well. From not only from a manufacturing standpoint to a more retail storefront angle presently. So different lands have different uses, and it also ties into this. The reason I put the cosmetics example here is because it also ties into this environmental impact assessment and some of these other finer issues in selecting, picking your lease in step 2. So maybe you can just talk very briefly about that.
Yeah. So I mean, this used to be a much bigger thing for us because years ago, most projects were about manufacturing in China. And most of those projects were greenfield projects where somebody would go in, buy land, build a factory, or somebody would build the factory and lease it to them, etc. And so that kind of business, we don't see that often anymore. We occasionally see it, but mostly people are either doing retail, or if it's a cosmetics company, Look, I haven't seen one yet. I'm sure there are some, but I think most cosmetic companies don't set up their own factories. They might outsource the production. So, so I think, traditionally, and it's still the case today, is the land, and there's industrial land. I guess the big issue is, state-owned land is good. The allocated land is more complicated, and agricultural land is even more. Collectively owned land is more complicated. I think before you would set up somewhere, what you would look at is whether your industry is kind of at risk. And at risk would be chemical company. I think nowadays, chemical companies can probably only really set up in a chemical zone. And so Shanghai has SCIP, which is a big one. You might be able to get some local authority 4 hours out of Shanghai to allow you to set up. But the way that, the country keeps on developing, it's a big risk that you have to move and relocate. So I think, cosmetics is also, you probably want to set up somewhere where they have other manufacturers. It's safer. The most important thing will also be the environmental impact. And so, places like Kunshan that used to be really keen on manufacturing, they cause problems even for clients who are not particularly, strong. Like one client in Kunshan had a paint shop. That was a big issue. It was just a paint shop. It wasn't like that. Another client had like a baking kiln, like an incinerator. So I guess a little bit of emissions occurred, but these were big issues. And so I guess, appropriate land, we never really discussed it before, so maybe it's worthwhile discussing. So I think when you look at land, what I would be looking at is firstly, can I set up there? Can I do my business in there? Am I able to? Most important trigger is the environmental. I think it's pretty clear if it's going to be industrial or commercial, so that's pretty clear for people. And then secondly, I think you'd also look at what kind of restrictions there are, because China also, if you want a big piece of land, you have to also have a big investment. You can't just tie up land forever. And so there's something called the green ratio. So that can be very difficult because they want you to promise to invest a certain amount of money into that plot of land. So that's important. And then the environmental impact assessment, they'll be very cautious. I think even like Suzhou, which is, got a lot of manufacturing, they'll be very tight on what they allow in nowadays. And so it's not just emissions, wastewater, but also the amount of electricity you use and those kind of things. So, and then if you are buying a piece of land, which doesn't happen that often, tell the truth, we have more relocation projects than greenfield setup projects. Questions are infrastructure. Is it connected to natural gas? Is it connected to electricity? Is it connected to the red line? Who pays the infrastructure costs? These are all the issues on land.
Yeah, this is really good. I think before we go into number 3 here, if we just look at the days required for each step, the process itself is relatively straightforward. But the issues that we're talking about are kind of what need to be considered, in the background or in concurrently with the actual process, or even probably before the process even starts, to be honest. So setting up a WFOE is not necessarily what we're talking about here today. It's not just the mechanical parts. These are a lot of different issues. The virtual office for maybe tech companies, or those land issues like you talked about for the manufacturing companies, which as you pointed out, sign of the times might not be as popular as it was before, but still around.
I mean, on that, just to say what the sign of time, the strange thing is the only projects that we've been working on in the last year and a half when it comes to a greenfield production site are joint ventures where somebody is dealing with a Chinese partner. So it's kind of weird. I think, I don't think there's many companies, unless they had something very special that they would be, like Tesla, they would have built their gigafactory or whatever. That's the special case. I think most companies nowadays, if they would set up manufacturing, it's relatively rare, but if they would, they wouldn't construct a building. Because one of the reasons as well is it's so dynamic. what's the chance that you build the right size building for your business? You know, it might be like Goldilocks. Is it going to be just right, or is it going to be too big, going to be too small? And I think that's why people want the flexibility. And China has so much built up stuff, you know, and, you know, if you've got a good technology, yeah, you'll probably get the authority giving you lease-free access for like a year or something. So I think you'd have to look at the subsidies, look at the rent relief and things like that, especially if you're in a high-tech area, if you're like in something to do with autonomous cars or AI or that kind of stuff. You know, you've got a lot of opportunities to get a good deal.
Yeah, and those we talked a little bit about that in the previous episode. So if that's something you're interested in, you can check out episode 20 on the YouTube channel. So Mark, here we have the MOFCOM filing. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is MOFCOM filing. So it's just a filing at the MOFCOM. I believe before from reading your book that it used to be an approval process. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think the approval, you know, I think the big change was we used to have the Foreign Investment Guidance Catalogue, which was a very long document that would, you know, separate companies into, or sectors into encouraged, permitted, restricted, and prohibited. And so that was part of it. And MOFCOM was the what do you call it, the watchdog of that. And so, you know, I think now we've moved to a negative list. Probably the trend, yeah, I think the trend is clearly liberalization, but probably also it's fair to say where the authorities were concerned has changed over time. So it used to be a lot of things could only be done as a joint venture, and these were things that you often didn't fully understand why. But you know, they've relaxed. So perhaps the most interesting one is trading or after-sales service companies. Early on, it was impossible. You had to do a trading company. You really had to have like a joint venture with a Chinese majority, restrictions on who the Chinese partner was. And now it's probably the most common type of company that a foreigner sets up. So things have changed over time. And I think, you know, for the MOFCOM filing, there are some still sectors, if I'm correct, where you still need an approval. But for most people, it's not really the MOFCOM thing, and it doesn't appear on that document. It's more the operational licenses and how that works. And the problem there is, let's say if you're a value-added telco company, so let's say you're a service as a software company, or software as a service company rather, and you need some operational licenses, you first have to set up the WFOE, and then you have to apply for the VATS licenses. And so, yeah, this is difficult for people to understand. And so it's important that people understand the whole process. And you know, the business license itself is not enough for you to do business in anything which is a bit sensitive. You know, if you wanted to start, you know, mining rare earth or something, you know, you can't just, you know, get a business license, you know, saying I'm going to do mining. And so I think, you know, the first thing to look at is it possible to do the WFOE, to do the company as a WFOE? And then secondly, I would take the second step and do some thinking about, are there any operational barriers? Because for many of these companies, they set up and they have all these plans, but they find out they can't actually get the operational license in practice. So that's the nightmare which people should try to avoid.
Yeah, and like you said, that's it's one of those tangential issues that we're talking about today. It's not necessarily directly related to setting up the actual WFOE entity, but what point is the WFOE entity if you can't obtain the licenses? So you know, whether you can set up the WFOE is a completely different question than can you actually get the licenses. And so this picture here is just taking, you know, some of the questions and concerns that from years past that MOFCOM might have had. What sector are you? What size of investment? You know, pouring through the paperwork, but then just funneling it all into a simple, you know, MOFCOM filing. And that's kind of the fast track process these days that you might see for most sectors. Like you said, some are still restricted. And for this
one thing on that filing and the application, it's really worthwhile mentioning because it's also kind of amusing. I would say 1 in 3 applications we have get rejected because someone signed with a blue pen, or a green pen or something. And so we really put everywhere in the documents, sign only in a black biro, A4 and all this. And despite all this, people still sign in a blue pen. And I think it has to be a biro. It can't be like a fountain pen or something. And so you would be surprised how many people don't follow it. And this seems to be a bigger problem for MOFCOM than whether you want to do a online internet publishing company. It's a blue pen, because it's something which they can just immediately get excited about. So, so please follow the directions carefully.
I didn't put it here, but in the book, when I was reading this chapter, you wrote about, the passport pictures weren't cut to the exact size. And so this process, which is, already pretty much a hassle. I mean, not as simple as it is today, where it's just a simple filing, not even waiting for approval. It was just it was just one of those, you never knew when it was going to end type things.
Yeah, I used to. I mean, like that's worth making about the old days. It used to be more difficult, and it used to be so difficult. We almost always, I'd get a power of attorney from the company to sign on behalf. Like, I mean, it's very limited. I mean, all I can do is set up a woofie for them. It's not like I can buy a house or something. But yeah, the interesting thing was then you'd still be involved later when they want to, increase the registered capital or something. And I remember once they're going to get their increase the registered capital, and I was going there anyway, and we handed in the application materials, and the authority said, "Oh well, this signature doesn't look anything like the previous signature," and it was my signature, and I had my passport, and they insisted that I trace my signature, and I kept on trying to do it, and I just couldn't replicate that signature to their standards. So in the end, they helped me put it on a window, and we found a pen that could like trace it, and then I had to trace it exactly. So yeah, this is the kind of stuff they get up to,
I've seen your signatures, Mark. I think I've seen 2 or 3 different signatures from you. It's still a problem you have. Yeah. So for number 4, the race car picture is here because it's also been kind of fast tracked in a sense. Maybe Mark, I don't have any particular special slide for this one. It
would have been better if it was actually animated, like if it actually moved.
I'm scared that it might not show up in the Zoom presentation, so I don't put animations, but maybe next time I'll try.
Yeah, a little video of a fast car.
Yeah. So maybe Mark, what is the SAMR, the formerly known as the AIC, that registration process? What is it about, and how has it changed from days past?
I think it's always been very boring. I just used to like saying SAIC. I just can't say SAMA. It sounds like some kind of Turkish coffee pot or something. I don't know. It doesn't have the same kind of ring to it. So I think SAMR is a much bigger organization, I guess, than the AIC. But yeah, at least traditionally, it was always the MOFCOM approval that mattered, and the AIC registration. Really, I think in all those years, we only had AIC jump up once after MOFCOM approved it. So we kind of felt it was always a rubber stamp. The only thing where they might jump up is the business scope, because they will issue the business license. And I think I mentioned it last time, we once had a problem because the business scope in the Articles of Association that MOFCOM approved was too long for the business license, and they couldn't fit it in with the typewriter. So that was a problem. So I think, I can't remember anybody really having a big problem. I remember once, but I can't remember what the problem was. But that was, in all those projects, only once did the AIC jump up.
All right. So before we move on to the post-registration stuff, just to reiterate what we just talked about, step 1, 2, 3, and 4. The actual, I guess, filings and procedures for them are not anything too difficult, but there is a lot of consideration for each of those steps. And once you've finally got your way through, then you have some of these post-registration matters. These are things that I assume are done after you get your registration. So Mark, what is this Public Security Bureau and the bank account process? What do those look like?
Yeah, I've never been too involved. I think the Public Security Bureau, I think it's just the chops. I think it's just the
Yeah.
company chops as far as I remember. And then the bank account is worthwhile mentioning because a lot of people want to use like their home bank, like, Deutsche Bank has, 3, branches, or HSBC has a lot, or Citibank, or this. And really, in my experience, it's always such a pain, especially, it's really not really useful. I mean, monies are fungible. I think you'll all be much happier if you pick one of the large Chinese banks. And then, the KYC is actually pretty easy in China. So the bank account is a week or something. Try to open a bank account for a company in Hong Kong, I think it's like 6 weeks. So, it's a much easier process. I'd say on bank accounts, it's pretty easy, but best is to use one of the major Chinese banks.
And so the CHOP, I guess, is something that's quite unique to the China system. So once you get your WFOE set up, you will need a CHOP. But what is a CHOP and what is the purpose of the CHOP?
So the CHOP is that stamp. Like you said, I've got my signatures I don't have that discipline of keeping the signature right. So my own personal bank account, I remember many years ago, the bank actually requested me to make a CHOP. So I would actually chop my signature instead of signing the signature. And I still have that signature CHOP in the office to this day. So if I do go to the bank, I always have to use that if it's a paper. But now the problem is, of course, you normally sign on the electric touchpad, but they've become a bit more usual on this. So I think the CHOP, interesting is the CHOP will bind the company. So legally, the legal rep or the CHOP can bind the company. And so they're very important. There's not as much forgery of CHOPs as one would think. At least we haven't come across it too often. It's been a couple of times. But, look, my signature's been forged by people much more often, even other law firms. We had another Chinese law firm work on the on this legal opinion when I was at this other law firm because we couldn't issue a legal opinion. And so for some reason they needed my signature. And, I suddenly saw the document. I thought, that's not my signature. And the guy said, oh, I just signed it for you. I thought it would be easier. But he probably wouldn't have used my CHOP. He was taking that much more seriously. So I think the CHOP is important. It's a day-to-day thing. You normally, there's a company CHOP, a contract CHOP, a finance CHOP. Everybody's got different CHOPs. It's important to keep it under control. I think, we would normally say for WFOEs, the legal rep will be somebody offshore outside the country. And if it's of a certain scale, you probably would have the CFO hold the CHOP. Some people have a law firm or a corporate services firm hold the CHOP. Difficult. I think it's difficult. Probably the legal representative, because he might have this CHOP. Like I've got my CHOP. Sometimes people leave the CHOP there because there are some documents, normally tax filings, but sometimes things like a tender, they want the legal rep to sign off. But everybody in China is quite happy if it's just the personal CHOP of the legal rep. It's interesting, how people are used to things. And in some cases, I remember it was very early on with Volkswagen, which is probably the biggest company in Germany at that time, or one of the biggest companies in Germany. There was a contract, but the Chinese side could not believe that Volkswagen didn't have a CHOP. So Volkswagen had to make a CHOP for this contract. So they signed it under German law, but then they also got a nice CHOP made so they could chop it as well. That's like 20 years ago. So
I guess
yeah.
No, I guess the biggest issue that we come across regarding CHOP is you've lost the CHOP, or the legal rep quit and ran away with the CHOP. So for best practices, this is usually you want to keep close control of the CHOP, because like you said, it is actually binding onto the company.
I've never heard anyone lose the CHOP. I've heard the general manager quite often run away with the CHOP, and what we do there is we just announce as quickly as possible that it's been stolen and put a public announcement, and that takes time. So I think if you were going to sack your general manager, one of the things we always suggest is secure the chops, secure the original documents early on, and before COVID, we would normally invite the general manager to go overseas, just that he couldn't, grab stuff on the way out. So, so I think the chops are important. So it's worthwhile keeping in mind.
And one last matter before we go into the management structure is the Articles of Association, which do discuss about the management structure. Mark, I guess this is Articles of Association is not unique to China. This is it's pretty standard practice for around the world for setting up companies. But maybe you just want to talk about some of the more interesting points for a Chinese WFOE's Articles of Association.
I think the first thing is there's nothing interesting in the article. Really, there's just nothing interesting at all. It's just the most boring document of all time. And so it's very basic. It's very simple. I'm trying to think what would be interesting. Yeah, the business scope is kind of interesting because we've discussed that. It's something you have to look at. Board of directors. Are we going to discuss that later? Are we?
Yeah, we'll discuss that later. I guess if you don't have anything to add, what I will do is we had a viewer send an email and she said that she thinks that the most interesting part about it is the scope, like you said, and also the registered capital, because these are major issues if a Chinese company or another company wants to buy you or partner up with you. When they're doing their due diligence on your company, they're going to mostly look at those are the two kind of key starting issues that they would probably tend to look at first. So thank you to Feng for that.
But one of the issue with the registered capital, we did. I mean, that was kind of interesting. I don't know if I mentioned it last time, but we had this company, American company, set up, and the local team really wanted to have this massive registered capital, and we kept on saying, well, you're going to have to pay that money in. They said, oh, no, he's got a special deal. And then you look at the investment agreement, it was very clear they're going to have to pay the money in. And so I think there you have to be careful, because registered capital, you have an obligation to pay in the money. And it's very easy to increase registered capital, but very difficult to decrease. But really, apart from that, articles are just not interesting at all.
So this is, I guess, also not a very interesting topic, but we should discuss is the board structure, the management structure of the WFOE, and who can be what and what do those positions actually do. So, Mark, we don't need to go over every minute detail. I guess it can be discussed in more detail, but maybe we should not bore the audience. But maybe you could just give us a quick overview.
Okay. So I think the board of supervisors, I'm a supervisor of a couple of companies, and I've never done anything. I think that's what everybody does. So I think nobody has ever done anything as a supervisor in a WFOE. But I guess technically the supervisor's there, and really hardly anyone has a board of supervisors in a WFOE. They'll just have one supervisor. And many would think that's one too many, but they don't do anything and don't cost anything, so it's not a big issue. And I think really their only role is if the board and the management conspired against the investor, then they would have standing to do something. Not sure what they would do, but they could do something theoretically. And then I guess the board, 1 to 13, well, one's not a board, it's an executive director. They seem to be becoming more popular. I think, it took 10 years to see the first executive director. And now I'd say 1 in 3 or 1 in 5, it's just an executive director. As WFOEs are more set up as for smaller things. It used to be a bit of a drama setting up a WFOE, or people have big plans. I think with a WFOE, I don't think I've ever seen more than 3 directors. I mean, 13, it would be really hard to imagine. So I think it's really 3 is the magic number. I would normally separate the management from the board, but people often don't listen to me. And, the board, they have to meet once a year, but it's really all slack. The directors don't have to be China residents, don't have to be China nationals. They can do whatever they want. They can do the meeting by fax. They can do it, virtually by Zoom. So I think really the formal requirements are very minimal.
Yeah. And here we have some of the fiduciary duties. Again, this is not necessarily something that's unique just to China WFOE directors, but this is still something that I think should be discussed at least a little bit while we're discussing everything WFOE. So, Mark, what are some of the duties of the director?
Yeah, so I think they've got fiduciary duties like the duty of care, duty of loyalty. They have some kind of specific wordings like you can't profit from the company, you can't conceal different arrangements, but they're all very loose and they're very broad. And I think it's just common sense. I mean, there's nothing in there that you'd say, oh, that's a surprise. Most people who are going to be appointed as directors, they're not concerned about their fiduciary obligations to the company, because most of them at least don't disclose to you that they intend to embezzle from the company or do those things. Most people are more worried about what kind of obligations they could have for the activities of the company. I think the issue is we try to advise people in a pragmatic way. So from a liability perspective, the liability of the company will rest primarily with the company. So it'll be the company that will be held liable. It could be that with creditors, employees, other third parties, you could, but I think mostly it's only if you've been involved in the decision making. So if you've been involved in a massive smuggling operation and you're on the board and you've been approving this, then you could be in trouble. If you're the legal rep, you may not want to be around, especially if you're a foreign legal rep, you may not want to be around if you're liquidating a company and the employees are going, bananas. I think that's one issue. If you have a large, even any civil dispute, you need to be a little bit careful because some Chinese companies are able to get travel bans. So once you enter the country, you can't leave. So again, if you're a legal rep, you would have you'd have a much higher risk of that happening than if you're not. If you're not, difficult to see how they can pin it on you. Duties under special environmental protection, production safety, tax, customs. So they're the main ones. I think that's again, if you were in charge of a company that's doing a massive pollution or there's a big oil spill, production safety, if the factory burns down and kills a lot of people, this is where you will get in trouble, And so there is, but it's the outlier. It's not the normal case. We had a case where some gas cylinders blew up and people died. That was a bit hair-raising to be the legal rep at that moment. Tax and customs, again, large scale. I won't say the name of the company, but a company that we're working with, somebody was involved in something like that, and that person went to jail for like a decade or more. These are the trigger points where you could be at risk, but these are things that you should not have been doing. It's not like they're rounding you up for underpaying your social contributions. That's not the case.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so we're going to get into the legal rep in a little bit, but before I do, maybe just quickly go over the concept of business judgment. I think for most people who are opening up a WFOE in China, for example, are probably in business in their home countries and might be familiar with the business judgment rule. So it is something that is also applicable in China, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, look, like I say, you say it's applicable. I don't know because I've never seen it actually really happen. So, the D&O insurance, it's relatively new, that beast, and I don't really know what it would cover, to tell you the truth, because I don't think anybody gets in trouble if they act in good faith and all that. So I think that's really unlikely. And if you're acting criminally, I can't believe that the insurance will cover you. So I think, that's why probably D&O insurance is, at least in my experience, is largely a foreign thing. And I don't know, we should look into it. I'd be interested to know, maybe we can have someone look into it, whether they've ever paid out something under D&O insurance. I don't know.
Yeah. So get into the legal rep, because you did mention earlier that the CHOP can buy the company, but also the legal rep can buy the company. Maybe we should talk a little bit about the role of the legal rep in your China WFOE.
Yeah. So I think like a joint venture, it's only the chairman that can be the legal rep, but in a WFOE, it can be, the chairman if it's a board or an executive director, or it can be the general manager. And like I said, I think that can lead to problems. If the general manager is the legal rep and the general manager, it can be sometimes hard to kick them out. So, that's difficult. I think the legal rep, it gives the person a lot of face as well, and they can represent the company and bind the company. So I think if you really, if they sign a contract, the burden will be this presumed agency. So you'd really have a high burden to prove that the other party didn't know that this contract was legitimate. If they sold you $1 million property for 10 renminbi, okay, that's probably clearly something amiss. Legal rep, like again, tax documents, some contracts, but that's not the legal requirement. It's sometimes that the counterpart wants the legal rep to sign as well. So we've seen that quite often. And if they want someone personally, and sometimes you see the general manager sign, and there I think they do have this agency idea, but somebody prudent would ask to see the power of attorney for the legal rep, from the legal rep to the general manager, or have the company chop put on the contract. So I think, in a WFOE, the legal rep, he's got a lot of reserve power. And, I think in the WFOE, they don't really do that much day to day. They'll turn up to the board meetings. But if the general manager goes rogue, then it's important for the chairman to be involved, or the legal rep rather, because, it's the one person that people in China would identify as being higher than the general manager. And that's with the authorities, it's with all that. It's easier to discuss, the legal rep wanting the new chop than the investor saying, oh, I want a new chop, because there's that missing linkage to the WFOE. So for that reason, I really do recommend people not to combine the role, especially not with somebody that you don't know very well. But like I said, many people ignore that.
All right, so this legal rep position obviously is more substantial than the supervisor role that you mentioned earlier. And you did talk about D&O insurance, but I just put this slide here so that people can review it later. But I guess the point that I want to highlight specifically is in the yellow box with the black outline. Basically, to protect yourself, you like you said, Mark, this liability insurance is not going to cover any type of intentional or willful type of criminal acts. So if you want to protect yourself from another director or a legal rep or general manager who has gone rogue, you just need you should make that known through the corporate actions. So that's the kind of the takeaway here for.
But I think it's also important that people do wrong things, and because of the world of compliance, the head office is always, we've got zero tolerance for non-compliance, etc. But really, I think honestly, every time I've been a bit close to it, and of course, as a lawyer or corporate lawyer, you often don't ever know the truth of something which is very messy, because there's a lot of interest of the people involved to lie about it. Like people don't tell you the truth. But my suspicion is the head office is mostly complicit. So, it's no way they don't know that there's a massive smuggling thing going on. They should know that there was massive tax evasion going on. I think they kind of know it, but they either, conspire. And I think for people who are taking that role, which is difficult because, there's a lot of pressure to perform in China, and, a lot of people see growth and they say, 40% growth is possible in China. And sometimes you do things that you shouldn't do. One thing I would say is don't expect the headquarters to support you, because, your name is Sean Who. So you will go from being Sean Who to Sean Who, because they won't. They'll say, I don't know what Sean's doing. Oh, this is terrible. Yeah. Day one, it's like, we're going to do everything to protect these people. We're going to do everything. We're going to cover the cost. And then once it gets hairy, the headquarter people just like, I didn't know that. This is crazy. We're going to launch a compliance audit. So I think, just with this whole thing, anyone who really got into trouble in this kind of situation, I think they were doing something seriously wrong. It's
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
It's not
I gotta
nice.
say, I got him, Jim, sending me a message. All the people out there, that Sean Hu joke is. Mark calls me every day and he tells me that joke. Okay, so I would like to give him some credit and say this is something he thought of on the spot, but that is something I hear quite often. So, um, and we're out of time, Mark. But I put this here for everybody because I will be sending a copy of this presentation to everybody who registered. This is just a very quick and dirty checklist of all of the issues that we talked about. There's one here for pre-establishment. There's another one here for operational, and even for those ambitious enough, expansion as well. Like we said, the if I could just go back here, the process itself is pretty straightforward. Like I've said a couple times already, but we've already spent 2 episodes on this, and you can see that it's like I think, like you said, Mark, in the book, and I hear you say it still today, the process itself might take a month, but it can go 3, 4, 5 months, even a year, just because a lot of the other tangential issues have not been resolved. So, if you're considering a WFOE, please take a second, watch some of the videos. If you don't have time, just check out the checklist. These are the issues that will need to be decided on before setting up the entity. All right, so we did 2 episodes on WFOEs, Mark. Hopefully we can move on to something else for the next one.
You seem very bored with this topic, Sean.
I didn't know we could pull so much stuff out of a WFOE, but here we are.
Yeah.
But thank you
We'll
everybody
find a
for
new
watching.
topic. We'll think of something new and fresh.
Yeah, new and fresh for next time. Thank you everybody for watching, and I'll send you an email with the presentation soon. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you.